Good morning, good afternoon, or maybe good evening. Our registration indicates we have viewers from all across the globe. I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation and director of external affairs for our Friends of Ukraine network, and I am pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Post-NATO Summit Review. If you have questions, I note that you can use the feature below to submit them. That does not necessarily mean I will be able to get to them, but if I can, I will. We're honored today to have with us four members of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation's Friends of Ukraine network. Since Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014, FOUN has been active in offering priority recommendations for U.S. assistance to Ukraine, presenting information and analysis to Congress and the executive, and among other things, presenting webinars like this one. Today's panel includes Ambassador John Herbst, chairman of FOUN's Task Force on National Security. John has a long and distinguished diplomatic career at the Department of State, including as ambassador to Ukraine. Currently, John is the head of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Phil Breedlove, a retired Air Force four-star general. Phil has a fabulous career in the Air Force, including serving as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Among many other things, Phil now teaches at his undergraduate alma mater, Georgia Tech. I note that Georgia Tech is his undergraduate alma mater because he received advanced degrees from my alma mater, Arizona State. Debra Cagan is Senior Advisor at the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center. Debra is a retired career senior U.S. Department of State and Department of Defense official who held many key positions, including Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Coalition Peacekeeping, Humanitarian, and Disaster Relief, Senior Director of European, Russian, and Eurasia Security Issues, Special Advisor for strategic and nuclear policy, and many other critical, important positions. Ian Brzezinski, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ian's professional life has been foreign affairs. He has been on the National Security Council staff, a legislative assistant on national security affairs in the Senate, an advisor to Ukraine's National Security Council, and back here in Washington, Assistant Deputy Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO policy. Given this lineup, I hope you will recall I started off by saying we are honored to have this group of our National Security Task Force with us today. And it will be best for me to get out of the way. So as we review the NATO summit, Russia's war continues to show no signs of ending. Brutal assaults continue directed at civilian population and infrastructure. And Ukraine's determination continues even in the face of questionable support. We want to hear from our experts. John, for decades, you've been in the thick of things relating to NATO, Ukraine, and beyond. There was significant anticipation as this NATO summit approached, and now we have the summit itself to consider and reflect upon. Your thoughts, John?
I am more or less pleased with the outcome of the NATO summit regarding critical American security interests in Europe. I had very low expectations, and in fact, the run-up to the summit provided reasons to be doubtful about what would happen. First, at the last summit in Washington, the alliance decided to have a strategic review of policy towards Russia, reflecting the fact that Russia is a danger to NATO interests. And that study was shelved to avoid annoying the Trump administration. And surprisingly to me, at the NATO summit, you did have not simply agreement on increasing defense expenditures, a Trump requirement, which was a sensible one, but that was tied to the danger that Russia represents in Europe and beyond. which essentially is the whole point of having that study, which was shelved. So that was a very real positive. The fact that they increased defense expenditures or intended defense expenditures, they tied it to Russia. And while Zelensky was not given a formal role at the summit, again, accommodating what was believed to be Trump's position, he did have successful meetings there, including with the president. And more importantly, the NATO decision on increasing defense spending says that aid given to Ukraine by NATO members would count against their defense spending. A very serious sign of tangible support for Ukraine. And then finally, of course, Trump on the plane to The Hague for the summit, as he had for years, cast some doubt as to whether the United States really had an interest in providing security in the NATO alliance, as exemplified by Article 5. But in the NATO communique, small as it was, you had a very clear re-endorsement of Article 5. All of these things, by the way, were noted with great unhappiness in Moscow. And you know, when Moscow's unhappy, the United States and NATO are doing their job.
Okay. Phil, I know that for a number of weeks leading up to the summit, you were in Europe meeting with allies and others. I'm sure that what you heard then offers insights into how you see what happened at The Hague. Your thoughts?
Well, again, thanks for having me. And as always, a pleasure to be amongst this group of people who I respect immensely. Yep, but essentially, I spent 5 weeks in Europe, 2 trips, and was in 8 capitals. In almost every capital, I met with the defense minister, the chief of defense, other policy leaders, and in one capital, I met with the head of state. In general, the message was always the same. What do you think is going to happen? And then they would move on to how do we make this summit a success? What does it take? And a discussion of where our U.S. president was in sort of his words out there on the alliance. And notably, there was a very decided a conversation in almost every capital about it's time to recognize that Russia is never going to agree to peace. Each of the capitals, especially the conversations with the policy directors and a couple of the major think tanks, there was a broad acceptance that most, if not all, of the European capitals who were worried about this business all saw that Russia was completely signaling that they were not interested in peace. In fact, it was one of the think tanks who showed me a chart they had created, and in that chart, it showed every overture from America to Russia, from presidential calls to visits by State Department to visits by our emissaries, and the dates of those contacts immediately following, there would be some sort of a strong statement saying, you know, we are pressing forward or raising the ante every time some new demand in order to get to peace. All the way in the end game, of course, to where Mr. Putin has recently said that all of Ukraine belongs to Russia. And of course, Mr. Medvedev suggesting that nations should give Iran nuclear weapons. So this particular think tank is tracking all the times that America reaches out and receives a rebuff from Russia. And so the question in at least 2 or 3 of the capitals was, when is the U.S. president going to get angry at Putin like he got angry at Zelensky? And so there was a lot of angst going into this summit. And there was a lot of talk of we have got to have a positive summit. And I think, you know, one of the capitals I visited was Madrid. and that was a lively conversation. And I think that Madrid came to the right point in the end game, and that was very, very helpful in, I think, getting our U.S. president to come to the place they needed to be. I'll stop with the visit concern. I think that I would suggest to us something I have done now for 2.5 days is every time I get the chance, I put the words on the street that Russia is losing this war. And I talk about Russia needing to be bailed out by North Korea to retake sovereign Russian land. They could not do it without North Korea, and they still haven't done it with North Korea because there is still Ukrainians holding Russian land. I talked about the fact that Russian industry now has to have North Korean soldiers or North Korean individuals to man their factories because they are having problems with the demographic of people who run and work in these things. And then now, most recently, we hear that once again, Russia is going to North Korea asking for more soldiers. I talked about the number of Russians that have died in this war and the new sort of estimates. And even the low end estimates are over 1 million at this point. And I talked about how many they have lost in the last 3 or 4 months, and how little, very little land they have gained in that same time. And my question to America is, does this look like a country that's winning a war? And I would offer to you that I don't think so. So every chance I get, I at least plant the seed that Russia may not be losing this war, but they certainly aren't winning it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Deborah, I'm always anxious to hear your take on events. You have and maintain so many relationships in our government and across Europe and beyond. You've heard John and Phil. I know that you must have excellent thoughts to interject here, and I'm anxious to hear them.
Well, I'm going to leave it to Ian, whose insight and wisdom on outcome of the summit and some of the stuff that he's written before the summit, I thought was just excellent. So I'm going to kind of go off track a bit and talk a little bit about what I think are good news stories here. The first is Chancellor Merz. I'm sitting here firmly in his corner. The fact that a chancellor of Germany has said that they're going to build the largest land army in Europe and no one's batting an eyelash. Can you imagine that happening 20 years ago? Even the lack of the batting of an eyelash. I thought he seized the day at the G7 when he recognized some of the hand-wringing and the like by Macron and Starmer and made the comment he did about Israel doing dirty work for the West. I thought was brilliant. Whomever advised him to do that is a brilliant political advisor. And I thought he was very strong at the summit, and so strong that as Ambassador Herbst sent me a little notice today that there looks to be some subversive Russian action going on in Germany again, setting fire to German military assets. And this is very similar to when Rheinmetall said that they were going to start producing weapons for Ukraine. All of a sudden, the CEO of Rheinmetall's house was set on fire, and everyone believes that was a Russian as well. So I think that's positive. I think other positives that came out of this is the agreement by the Dutch government to start producing weapons for Ukraine in the Netherlands, solely opening up production lines solely for Ukraine, which is a really big deal. I think that there are other countries who have put items in their defense budget already, not just announcing this at NATO, but there's about 3 or 4 countries who have put items in their defense budget, excuse me, already that are designed to build capacity for Ukraine. But there are missing pieces. And the missing pieces are that, and General Breedlove and Ian know this well, that there has been an outsized dependence on U.S. defense industry to produce weapons that now everyone needs. And we saw the efficacy of Patriots most recently at Val Udid. But we're just not producing these fast enough, and we're certainly not producing the launchers and the interceptors fast enough. And Ukraine needs these as well, but I think there's a very long line of everyone who needs them. And what this has done, I think, which is critical, is shown the Europeans and our allies in the Pacific that just depending on U.S. industry to produce all these weapons and make them whole is probably unwise. And from my perspective as an American, I think that we are being foolish to think that the U.S. can meet the pacing threat from China by itself without engaging in these joint ventures with European and other companies. So what I think one of the good outcomes of the summit is this recognition that there has to be more of this joint cooperation. We will see if the US administration allows this to happen, because this focus on it just has to be in America means that we're never going to make enough for ourselves, let alone for anyone else. And so I think the positive is understanding what the problem is. Now let's go forward and fix it. Now, a couple of other things that were mentioned. General Breedlove, you talked about North Korea. Not only is North Korea sending soldiers to Russia, they're sending workers. Russia has very low, demographics. They're not birthing many babies, and they don't have the workers to work in their defense plants. So North Korea is now supplying workers to go to work in Russian industry and defense plants because there's not enough Russian workers to do the job. That's not a sign of a country that's surviving well, as General Breedlove said. And then a couple of other things on this. I am concerned that despite all of the good words that have come out of the summit, that success, that we're still not moving fast enough to keep up with the pace of the war in Ukraine or anywhere else for that matter. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of commitments and promises, but many won't get fulfilled for a couple of years down the line. And what happens now? Is there a way for the US to allow companies like RTX to start building or letting Ukraine produce spare parts for Patriots in Ukraine? I mean, this is a really seminal point here, because if there's not enough interceptors, if there's not enough rolled steel to produce those launch tubes, can Ukraine produce some of the things it needs for sustainment and maintenance of the weapons it is currently using? And I think that's the next very big step here, whether some countries, some of the West are working to do this, but whether the United States will allow this to happen. Because as most of you know, that if a weapon is produced for any service, and I'm looking at General Breedlove here, they own the IP, they own that. So that service has to allow that to go forward. And I think it's a mistake to sit on our hands on this one, because you use equipment, it runs out. Spare parts, you need spare parts to keep it up and running. And I think that to me is not a good story right now. And I think Russia is hoping against hope that we never allow this to happen. But we have to find a way to let Ukraine start producing what it can produce, which is spare parts and maintenance and equipment to keep those systems up and running.
Phil?
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt before Ian, but I would like to just pile on that a minute. The fact of the matter is, I believe that our current administration is looking for ways to do business in, with, and through Ukraine. And they're already talking about some programs in the drone category. But what Debra is bringing up, I think, is something that would appeal to our current administration if we could do some things that form business ties together. Sorry, Ian, for jumping in, but I think it's important.
Okay, Ian, it looks like your connection on I-95 has continued to stay stable while we're going on. I appreciate your taking the effort to make sure you could be here this morning. Deborah's referred to you. I've referred to you. Phil's just referred to you. Go ahead with your additions and thoughts.
I also refer to Ian.
Okay.
Well, you all are very generous. But Bob, you asked me to comment on the summit. So since this is the end of the school year, it's graduation week and such, I thought I'd kind of give a set of grades. And what were the three most important issues or matters that would define this summit? It was spending. It was what the U.S. was going to signal about its commitment to Europe and transatlantic security, and then what actions or inactions it would take regarding Ukraine. On spending, I give it an A minus. Now, without question, that's a huge lift for the administration, but also the Europeans to get the alliance, particularly the Europeans and Canadians, to commit to 5% GDP to spending. Fulfilling that ambition is going to be essential to actually operation regional defense plans to defend against Russian aggression. But it's a 10-year commitment, so we'll have to see if it will be fulfilled. So I gave that an A minus. When it comes to U.S. commitment, I actually say it's a C plus. Sure, there was lots of nice language, was signed off on a very short communique, and there was no explosion between Trump and his fellow leaders, his fellow heads of state. But this was an alliance that was kind of driven by European fear of Trump's anger and wrath. That's not a healthy reaction. That's not a healthy state of the alliance. And then, of course, everyone knows the administration is thinking or undertaking a big review of U.S. global force posture. And all signs indicate there's going to be a reduction in U.S. forces in Europe. Nothing was said by the president on that issue. That shadows the U.S. commitment to Europe. So I give that a C minus, unfortunately. And then when it comes to Europe, when it comes to Ukraine, this summit took place amidst a dramatic escalation by the Russians of their invasion and the brutality of their invasion of Ukraine. So as heads of state, we're pondering 10-year defense plans and 10-year industrial defense plans whose deliverables won't mature until 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Russia was hammering Kiev, Dnipro, other areas of Ukraine. Lives were being lost. It kind of gave the impression the alliance was kind of peering into the future to avoid the grim realities of the present, the very grim realities that NATO was established to deter and ultimately defeat when necessary. And there's no greater reflection of U.S. commitment to European security than what the United States does and does not do on Ukraine. And this summit, the alliance didn't do much. As John pointed out, the U.S. actually blocked the promulgation of a year-long effort to articulate a long-needed NATO strategy to deal with Russian aggression. That was de-exed because of the administration. Rubio said that there are going to be no sanctions, no escalation of sanctions by the U.S. against the Russians, because that would upset communications between the West and Moscow. That kind of blows my mind. That's the approach we take on economic pressure. The alliance didn't change its posture in any way. Yes, the Europeans are on their own increasing their assistance to Ukraine, which is good. But Trump himself said that he's not ready, is not considering, we'll have to see, he says, whether or not there'll be another U.S. tranche of assistance to Ukraine. So it was, unfortunately, on the most operationally urgent challenge before the alliance that NATO sat on its hands and peered into the future. So I had to give that a C minus. So that's my summary of what I think the impact of this summit was, because it's shaped by what was said, what was done, but also equally by what was not said and what was not done.
Well, Ian, you've made a lot of points that I've got to believe others will need to comment on. John, I go to you. I mean, you gave, in my mind, as good you didn't give grades, but you talked about the positives that came out of the summit, and there were positives, and Ian has indicated that. But what about the poor grades going into the summer vacation that Ian has given the student?
Look, I described the summit in positive terms overall because of the very low expectations that most of us shared regarding the outcome. Ian's focus is different, quite legitimate, on the long-term challenges facing American national security. And he's absolutely right that Russia is our adversary. They call us their adversary number one, and that we need long-term policies that explicitly acknowledge that and address that. And we have not seen that from this administration. So yes, it would be wonderful. Well, first, it would have been wonderful if Biden had said publicly and repeatedly the problem posed by Moscow's war in Ukraine for us. He only intimated at that. Trump doesn't even seem to understand that, although some of his team do. So the policy overall is not where it should be. But the things that happened at the summit are indications that the policy could move in that direction, not that it has. I just sent in a draft piece, which will be put on the Atlantic Council blog by the end of the day, where I said it was a good week for American foreign policy, but not a decisive week, precisely because the challenges of the moment presented not just by Russia, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, which is a much less of a problem now for reasons that Phil excellently stated, we are not addressing in a serious, comprehensive way. And the most immediate challenge we face is by Russia's aggression in Europe. And administration policy has not identified that as the problem that it is. So I am heartened that we did not take a step backwards in the last several days. I think it's fair to say we took some steps forward, but not big steps, not giant steps. We need to take those steps. And it's conceivable, this is though conceivable, not certain, not even 51% likely, that the positive steps we've seen in the past several days would lead to even more positive steps addressing those.
Yes, Phil.
Sorry, I just want to pile on to something John said, and also Ian and Deborah also got to it. But I'm often asked, what is the most important thing we give Ukraine? And the people who ask that question are almost always thinking about a piece of hardware. And I am consistent in addressing something that was sort of inferred in all of these remarks, and that is that I think the most important thing that the United States could give Ukraine right now is a public, demonstrative, loud and proud, all over the place statement that we are going to support Ukraine until Russia is out of Ukraine. We don't have to say defeated. We don't have to use any of these words that apparently scare our administration to death. But we can say that, oh, by the way, maybe we're going to live up to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. I was asked the other day, well, the president wants to do a deal. I reminded him we have a deal. America was before this administration, America is during this administration, and America is after this administration. And we have a deal with Ukraine, Russia, and the United Kingdom. It's called the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. And if we just demonstratively, publicly, loud and proud, paid commitment to our deal, it would make a huge mistake, or not mistake, it would make a huge statement for Ukraine and be very impactful, I think, to Mr. Putin and Russia. I'm sorry.
Well, Phil,
I'm off of my soapbox.
Well, Phil, I want to remind our audience that the whole group, Friends of Ukraine Network, has been on that same soapbox in our annual recommendations for quite some time. You know, the booklets that we put out with number one recommendation has been a clear, unequivocal public position by the United States in support of Ukraine getting Russia out of its territory. A lot has been said. This may be a little bit off of where we've been heading, but in talking about the 5%, part of that is supposed to be used to build capacity, as I understand it, capacity for building weapons and so on and so forth. Uh, and I know that Phil talked about this on one of his, probably more than one of his interviews, and others have as well. The big difference between the time it takes for the United States to come up with a weapon system and get it into the field, I think Phil, you said 5 to 7 years. That's not good anymore. And I guess the leaders in the world right now are the Ukrainians who put something out. If it works, it works, and it's in the field right now, or it's replaced by something that will work. Do, any of the discussions or any of the talk about capacity and ability to make weapons for Europe and for the war and so forth, are they considering how to get through the bureaucratic log jams of how long it takes to get a weapon approved and ready to go?
All right, let me, if I can just jump in here. So two things. One is some countries are, yes. Some countries understand that Ukraine has developed electronic countermeasures and early warning systems to the onslaught of Russia, everything from Kinzhals to Shahids, from actual thought process to mocking up a development to producing and then deploying 3 to 4 months, as opposed to what would take us. So that's everything from having an idea in someone's head to actually getting it out there. And that's for a major system countrywide. This has been picked up on by many of the U.S. services, as General Breedlove knows. It's been looked at very carefully how you do this. And I think the Defense Innovation Unit in the Pentagon gets this. And that's why they have invested in some of the programs in Ukraine to see how this is done. Whether the contracting process, the bidding process, and everything else with the services will change at light speed is still a question, but there are some chiefs of staffs of the services who understand this and who want to change this dynamic. But having said that, I'm sorry, I have to go back to something else about whether the administration will ever understand that defeating Russia and Ukraine is essential to the safety and security of the American people. And I think it is this straight line that they either don't want to recognize or are afraid to recognize, but there is a straight line between Iran's ability to attack the US and its allies, and to launch weapons, and Russia, and to a more recent extent, China. So Iran could not do what it has been doing for the past 46 years without substantial help from Russia, the Soviet Union, and then Russia. It hit the amount of investment that Russia made to allow Iran and Assad to kill between 640 and 740,000 Syrian civilians was not possible without Russia. It was not possible for Iran to fire missiles and its proxies to fire missiles at the US without Russia. It was Russia who gave Iran its first centrifuges after Germany pulled out of the Siemens reactors. Unless this administration is just scared of Russia, there has to be a recognition of that straight line between Iran's ability to wreak havoc on sea lanes, on choke points, on everything else, and Russia. Now, more lately, just in the last couple of years, that includes China, who has helped Iran produce missiles and some warheads. But up until this time, it was Russia. It was Russia who supported Hezbollah and Hamas. It was Russia who did training of the IRGC. So what baffles me is the inability of this administration to understand that Russia, by using Iran, has been killing Americans. And unless that line, that very clear line, is drawn, there's not going to be an understanding of how defeating Russia in Ukraine is very positive for the safety, security, and the lives of the American people. And that to me is what is essential here. And suggesting that Iran is an enemy, North Korea is an enemy, but not Russia, is some sort of fantasy that does not look at the reality of the situation on the ground. So General Breedlove asked, what it will take. That's what it will take. That straight line between Russia and Iran, and understanding that Iran has not been able to do what it has been able to do to this point without Russia. And even though Russia is sort of feckless right now and can't do a lot, because it's just overextended and overexpended. Iran's know-how and abilities were done by Russia. And the sooner this administration, that Donald J. Trump understands that that's who his pal Putin is, and that's who his pal Putin, when he was head of the FSB, pushed to give those centrifuges, those initial centrifuges to Iran, this will not change. I'm sorry, I had to put that in here.
Well, Deborah, I thank you. I mean, I think that you're so articulate in making that case. And we've all, in webinars and writings and so forth, never understood why the administration doesn't understand what I thought was obvious and you've just made very obvious. The administration, and it's not just this one, has never approached Russia as our enemy, which is clear as day. We had a question to that very point, and I think it came in just about the time Deborah started answering it. We don't know. John, do you have any clue? I mean, other than maybe as Phil talked about Maved, I never pronounce his name right. But somebody in Russia every 10 days uses the word nuclear. I mean, and we've had over and over for years now, we've talked about you have to deter your enemy, not be deterred. And we seem to be deterred or being ostriches to what Russia is to us.
Okay, there are many, many, many angles to these questions. I'll try to simplify it so I don't speak too long. In the case of Biden and his administration, so 3 times Biden identified the problem. He talked about the axis of rogue actors, meaning China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And sort of we need to be able to stop them. And one place to do that is in Ukraine. But he never pushed that very hard because he had been intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. Okay, so that's the past. With Trump, it's more complicated than that. Or with the Trump team, it's more complicated than that. We know that there are people within the administration, including at senior levels, who recognize as clearly as we do that these 4 countries are working hard against our interests, and the way to stop them is by strength properly applied. And the best place to do that is in Ukraine, where not one American soldier needs to die to achieve that objective. I would put in the category of sober thinkers, Secretary of State Rubio, outgoing National Security Advisor Waltz, General Kellogg. There may be others, but those clearly are people who understand this. I think probably Ratcliffe understands it too, CIA Director Ratcliffe. But we also know that there are other actors, not just in the Trump administration, but in Trump world with access to the president, who are clueless that, in fact, this group of 4 is coming for America's lunch and for America's dinner too. And that group for sure does not want to provide American support for Ukraine. They don't see Russia's activities in Ukraine or more broadly in Europe as a danger to the United States. But there are also members of that group that felt the same way about Iran and saw no reason to help Israel take down Iran's nuclear and other defense capabilities over the past 2 weeks. Tucker Carlson, certainly one of them, Steve Bannon, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And if you believe the reporting, that may include certainly Tulsi Gabbard on the inside, and maybe even Secretary Hegseth on the inside. I say if you believe some of the reporting. I'm not saying I endorse it. I don't know enough. And there are even people in Trump world who would not extend American power to prevent Xi from seizing Taiwan. The good news, but I don't want to overstate this good news, is that the weak voices in that world kind of took some serious punishment from Trump when they challenged his strike on Iran, starting first and foremost with Tucker Carlson. And the fact that there was reporting that both Gabbard and Hegseth were kind of put on the sidelines as Trump made the decision to strike suggests maybe people on the inside too have taken their lumps in the past couple of weeks. And since that group has been reluctant or unable to recognize the danger to American interests posed by Russia and the other three together, that means that's a good thing for where the Trump administration may ultimately go. But notice my careful words, may ultimately go, not will go. So that's what we've got.
Ian, you're still sitting on the side of I-95. I don't want to leave you. I'm sure you've got some thoughts here.
Look, the fundamental problem we have with the Trump administration, despite its factions, is that the president and the strongest faction now in his team do not see America as having vital interests in Europe. The president looks at Europe not in a traditional way, doesn't look at World War II as even kind of a worthy investment of what we did in World War II. He sees Europe as basically a domain that's a place that we sell our goods and services, buy our stuff. He sees it as a domain that's the home of our economic competitors, particularly the EU. He looks at most Europeans on security side as feckless and weak and exploitative of our largesse. That's the approach he brings to the transatlantic relationship, and that's the approach that shapes his outlook on Ukraine. Added to Ukraine, of course, is his history with that country and this relationship with his own political fortunes and misfortunes. And then a third factor shaping it, he has long desired and continues to desire for a cooperative relationship with Russia and with Putin. It's kind of like continues to pursue a reset plus. And you see it in his statements, you see it in Rubio's statements, you see it in Witkoff's statements, this kind of yearning for economic deals, even so much as to say the United States and Russia can jointly sell energy to Europe, notwithstanding the fact we'd be doing with Putin, who is a war criminal. So this is the outlook that shapes the administration's approach to Ukraine and makes it a real challenge to help push them in the right direction so they can actually get into a posture where they're leveraging American and transatlantic power to enable the Ukrainians to defeat this aggression. And the tragedy is that we have the resources. We have massive overmatch in terms of power, military power, economic power, ideological power. We have just not demonstrated the political will or intent to exercise it.
Well, yes, and we get so many mixed signals. I mean, we've talked about some positive signals from the administration. We've talked about negative ones. I mean, now court of aggression has been approved. One of our Friends of Ukraine network has been deeply involved in that. And at the same time, I mean, this week that's been announced, and now we hear that Trump wants to cut all funding to the United States' funding of research into war crimes. I mean, what? No, we're not going to have even suggest or look for any retribution for war crimes and genocide. It's really staggering. I'm sorry, Deborah, I saw your hand up and I talked. I give you.
No, it was a really good statement. Look, a couple of other things to just pile on to what Ian and John and General have been saying here. I don't know what drives this administration any more than I knew what drove the Biden administration, but we've had 3 successive administrations, 4 if you count Trump twice, that have this bizarre fear of Russia. It is as if we're not a superpower. And so it has driven multiple administrations to do these sort of Faustian bargains with Putin in the hopes that he will somehow like them. And some of you've heard me say this before, but the affection for Putin is kind of lost on me because I always compared it to if you were going out on a date and the guy didn't pay for dinner by the third date, it was time to walk away. And Vladimir Putin's never going to pay for dinner. And people have to understand that he's never going to open his wallet and pay for dinner. And it's time to walk away. And it is almost like you're seizing defeat from the jaws of victory here. The U.S. is now the number one supplier of LNG to Europe, number one. And yet there are people in Trump world who wants to sign bargains to bring Russia back into a market that would in effect hurt US LNG producers. It is totally illogical. It makes no sense. But it's almost like begging for someone to like you and trying to buy them off to like you, which is incomprehensible to me because John's heard me say this before. No one has ever woken up in the morning thinking that Vladimir Putin is going to do them a favor. And I don't think President Trump should wake up in the morning thinking that either, because it's just not going to happen. And so I don't know if we're operating out of fear, because I do think I've seen this in previous administrations where they're just afraid of this Russian escalation thing and afraid of war. But we're also a superpower and a much better one than Russia will ever be. And this focus on, well, it's just got to be China, that doesn't work because as we've seen most recently in Iran, you need access, spacing, and overflight, and your allies to help you with things. You can't do it all by yourself. It's great to sit there and say what the bombs we were able to drop, what we were able to do, but you also had to do access, spacing, and overflight. You have to kind of get from there to there. You got to overfly certain countries. You have to have other things, you have other facilities in other countries that aid with this sort of thing. And you can't do it alone despite what they're thinking. So I am flummoxed as to this fear of Russia, which to me is, sort of a lot worse off than it ever has been. I don't have a problem of kicking your enemy when they're down. Other people think that's a nasty thing to say, but it's my Chicago street roots. But I don't understand this, and I do think it's driven by fear of escalation. And I think in that way, this administration is no different than Biden and no different than Obama on that.
Yes, Deborah. I'm going to read the question the way it is. I think it opens to a slightly broader discussion, but would you say that at least one link in the axis of evil has been seriously damaged by the recent U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities? And actually, I'm going to ask Deborah on this because before we came on the air, Deborah was talking about information relating to what really has happened.
Well, I'm going to go back to what Chancellor Merz said. First of all, I think it was great that this reluctant superpower finally took action to do this. But I also think it's correct to say, and I look toward the air warrior here, that had Israel not successfully suppressed Iranian air defenses and created an air corridor, the U.S. never would have done this because the chances of us being hit by Iranian AAA would have been higher. And so I'll just say that this again is another point that you can't just go it alone because it doesn't work, despite this view that you can. I'm sorry, General Breedlove, over to you.
Well, I agree with you in principle. I would say it was way more than an air corridor. This essentially, Israel established air superiority over the western half of Iran, and they established air supremacy over Tehran itself and the defenses for Tehran. And what we saw was Israel was beginning to disassemble the Iranian military in detail, taking away first their best aircraft. Oh, by the way, bombing all their great Russian surface air missiles into piles of rubble, and so Israel was disassembling Iran's military. This accomplished two things. As you said, it made it much simpler for the U.S. air package to go in. Now, the U.S. air package put aircraft in front of the bombers that are extremely good at suppression of enemy air defenses, and they were working on anything left behind. But certainly they started from a very, very good place because of what Israel had already done in that part of the country. And the second thing I would say is I think that as it relates to the original question that Bob posed, I think more than where that question went, I think what happened to Iran was a message. And that message is that the U.S. president, whether you support him or not, the U.S. president told Iran you have 60 days. And Iran fee-fiddled around, as we say down here in the South. They fee-fiddled around and didn't get anything accomplished in that 60 days. And the U.S. president had enough, and he acted. And that message, I don't think, was lost on the rest of the axis of evil. And there are those of us who of course, wish the same U.S. president would come to the same sort of conclusion about Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin, two facts. He's a war criminal, period. Second fact, he is not a partner in peace as it relates to Ukraine. He has no intention of making peace as it relates to Ukraine. And when this administration finally comes to those points, one would hope that the demonstration in Iran would send them a clear message.
Well, there's Karen Rosenberg has asked a question that I think relates to this. We, the United States, President Trump, took action in Iran, and he had a solid, successful ally that cleared the space, that was doing all that went on before those bombs. Is a hesitancy, or possible some of the hesitancy of taking on Russia in the same way, because he doesn't see that we have an ally like Israel was there in the war against Putin?
Bob, if I could just build and slightly differ with General Breedlove. I think General Breedlove made an excellent case of what could be the message the Trump administration could send if it chooses to send that message. I mean, if there's anything that came out that was constructive on this attack, it was it demonstrated Trump was willing to use force. The question is he willing to use force in defense of Ukraine to end this war? And that to me is not clear. And I think if he hasn't, from what was signaled from the summit, he hasn't, it would be rooted in two factors. One, he's seeking a partnership with Russia. And of course, that kind of threat wouldn't be helpful to that end. And then two, to build on Deborah's point, he is as concerned, if not more scared, than Joe Biden was on the risk of escalation that comes with any kind of exercise of force against the Russians. So I hope and I wish that he would use this moment to position American power to put more leverage and pressure on Russia to end this invasion. But I just don't have the confidence he's going to do that based on his outlook on Europe and on Russia.
Violent agreement with Professor Brzezinski.
Me as well. I want to have a chance to say just one more thing because I'm going to have to go to another meeting here. I think this administration and the intelligence community in general is not looking at something that I have found very interesting of late. When Ukraine was able to strike as deeply as it did against Russian aircraft up in the high north, essentially, and Alenia, that was really interesting. But what was more interesting was some of the battle damage assessment that was done. A lot of those aircraft that were hit we're not in good operating condition, meaning that at least one leg of Russia's nuclear triad was not in great shape. And General Breedlove and I have talked about this offline before. But it makes me wonder whether we are seriously looking at whether Russia has done what it needs to do to maintain its its ICBMs and its IRBMs. We've seen that they've spent a lot of time on their short range systems like the Iskander, which is nuclear capable. And maybe that's where the investment has gone. But I have to wonder whether Russia has even bothered to do what it needs to do to maintain its longer range nuclear systems and its medium range nuclear systems, like replacing its tritium, which has a shelf life. Do we know that that's going on? Because based on the condition of some of their nuclear submarines and these aircraft, it leads me to wonder whether Russia is falling apart there as well. And if that's the case, we should not be running scared with our tail between our legs here. We should be trying to understand whether Russia's even falling down and maintaining critical legs to its nuclear triad. And so I just throw that out there. Sorry to be explosive, no pun intended.
Deborah, I know you have to leave, and I really want to thank you for taking the time to be able to be with us this morning. But I want to acknowledge that you made the effort to be here, and you did say that you had to leave at 10. So thank you. Everyone else, since we are approaching the end of the time frame, why don't we have a round of last comments or cross comments from everybody, and I'll start, John, with you.
Okay, thank you. I think it's clear that I am the least pessimistic of our panel regarding where American policy can go. Notice I'm not saying has gone or will go. The point is that Ian's assessment of Trump's own outlook, I think, is correct. And so that is clearly an obstacle towards the strong policy we need to stop our adversary in Europe, and not just Europe, Russia, from undermining our security and our prosperity. But it's also true that there are sound minds, not just in the administration, but also Republicans in Congress, who recognize the stakes for the United States. And that Trump's own stated policy of achieving a durable peace in Ukraine by putting pressure on the party obstructing that peace is something he has not backed away from, and something that we can use to encourage him to do the right and the smart thing. It doesn't mean we'll get the result we want, but it means there's a fighting chance that this could be the outcome. And steps taken by the president himself are things we can use in trying to achieve this.
Thank you. Phil?
Well, I want to end on a positive note, and actually I think I'm closer to John than he actually sees or interprets. I believe if you watch the subtle changes in the way that the Secretary of State and even the president is beginning to act, his interaction with the young Ukrainian reporter, etc. And even if you look at some on Fox News and others, they're starting to talk about the intransigence of Russia. So I think we're beginning to see no promises, no declarations of continuation, but we're beginning to see a gentle changing of the approach to Russia. And once I think our president really gets it that Putin is not a partner and has no intention for peace. Once our president finally understands that, I think he might do the right thing. I really do.
Ian?
I'll try and do my best to end on a positive note. If these signs that the president is shifting his posture in the right direction, And if it's going to happen in a time that's going to be, or in a pace that's going to be quick enough to put Ukraine, or to bring momentum back to Ukraine, give the initiative back to Ukraine in this battle, it's going to be the Europeans are going to have to shape that and drive that. It is Europe's hour. And Europe has shown signs that it is willing to do more for Ukraine, increasing its economic assistance, talking about more economic sanctions. My hope is that the Europeans will accelerate that transition and this summer act decisively to leverage its economic power, to leverage its military power, to leverage its ideological power against Putin. Not only will that enable Ukraine to recapture the initiative, that is the most effective way to convince Trump that he should do what he needs to do and join that effort, because he has instinct to be with the winners. And he will never do anything more than the Europeans on Ukraine. And the only way the Europeans will get the United States to do more is if they do more. So they're moving in the right direction, and I'm hoping they'll accelerate that effort, because if they do, there's a real prospect the Trump administration will fall behind.
Well, I thank you.
With that.
I thank you. I think everybody on this call, certainly the panelists, have heard me say this before. There have been people in this administration who have gone to Moscow, have come back, and so forth, and say, the devil is in the details on this working toward peace. If the time comes when they realize the devil is at the table, maybe the administration will realize what we're hoping it will realize. I thank all of you for participating. I thank our audience for being with us. I think we basically covered answers to the questions that came in, although maybe not precisely and directly. So I thank the audience for being here. This will be cleaned up and posted on YouTube and our website at the foundation. And I wish everybody a good day and a good weekend. Thank you for attending.